He didn't recognize her smile, because it was taken the day after the fire, the day they buried their parents. There are photographs that survive time, not because of what they show, but because of what they refuse to reveal. The edges curl, the colors fade, but the silence they carry grows louder with each year. In Ash Hollow, Vermont, where fog rises like breath from the ground and churches still creak in the wind, a single photo fell from an old Bible in a forgotten thrift shop. It was wrapped in wax paper, folded twice, and sealed with a rosary bead. The man who found it had not spoken his sister's name in over 2 decades. The woman in the photo wore her hair in braids, and a scar that wasn't there before the fire. They had promised never to look back. But this photo, it was not supposed to exist. Have you ever buried a memory so deep you convinced yourself it never happened? And what if, years later, a single object made you relive it, frame by frame, breath by breath? If you've asked yourself these questions, you're not alone. Sometimes we run not from the people we've lost, but from the part of ourselves that watched it happen. And when time hands us a mirror, it doesn't ask for permission. It only reflects what we refuse to carry. This is the story of Elijah and Maren, a brother and sister who vanished from each other's lives after a night that burned down everything they knew. But a photograph, a single photograph, was about to speak. Some stories aren't passed down, they resurface. And when they do, they don't knock. They bleed through the cracks of ordinary days, like the way Elijah's hands trembled when he turned the photograph over. No message, no date, just her face, her eyes, distant, older than they should have been, and behind her, the chapel still standing, the same chapel that burned. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in 22 years, Maren. He whispered it now like a prayer he no longer believed in, and somewhere in the hollow it echoed. They were children the night the fire swallowed the house. They were siblings the moment their father didn't return from the flames. But they became strangers when the silence between them grew louder than grief. Elijah stayed in Ash Hollow, rebuilding his life like one of the barns he restored, brick by silent brick. Maren vanished, leaving no trace except the memory of her crying in the snow, barefoot and bloodied, holding something he never saw. Now her photo, her smile in his hands, and the old chapel in the background, untouched by flame. There are places memory can't erase. Ash Hollow was one of them. Have you ever had your healing interrupted by something you thought was gone forever? And when it returned, did it knock gently? Or did it break the door open with a memory you never wanted to remember? When grief is buried too soon, it festers in the soil. When siblings survive what others don't, sometimes survival becomes the heaviest weight to carry. And when something sacred is lost in tragedy, time waits. It waits for a moment, a sound, a photo, to bring it all back. Elijah sat in his truck outside St. Jude's, where the nuns still sang hymns in Latin, every Friday at dusk. The same place his mother once taught music, the same place Maren hid behind the altar and hummed lullabies to herself in the dark. The chapel was supposed to be ashes, but here it was, in the photo, standing, watching, waiting. He lit a candle. He stared at the photo, and for the first time in over 2 decades, he felt her breathe beside him. If this feeling is familiar to you, comment, "I've felt it too." Sometimes the only way back is through the fire you never finished walking through. The last night they saw each other began with music. Their mother had filled the house with a melody, something soft from the old upright piano in the living room. It was a habit of hers playing through dinner prep, while the scent of cinnamon and smoke drifted from the kitchen. Maren was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching the stained glass windows she remembered from the chapel at St. Jude's. Elijah was pacing, always pacing, mouthing the Latin verses their father insisted they memorize. It was cold that night, the kind of cold that stiffens breath and makes every sound feel louder. And when the scream came, it didn't come from outside. It came from upstairs, from the master bedroom, from behind a locked door. Their father, a man of silence, a man of scripture, never screamed. But something had broken him that night, and in the seconds that followed, the fire began. There was no lightning, no stove left on, but the house ignited as if it had been waiting to burn. The flames spread from the upstairs hall, from that very door, and devoured the walls like parchment in a holy fire. Maren had pulled Elijah by the collar. "Don't go up," she'd whispered. But he had already seen something she didn't want him to see. Their mother, collapsed in the stairwell, her hands scorched, holding a small scorched Bible, and beside her the faint sound of chanting, not in English, not in Latin. Something older, something colder. Elijah never spoke of that sound. Maren never spoke of the object she carried as they fled into the snow. In the weeks that followed, Maren stopped speaking entirely. Elijah testified, told the authorities it was an accident, told them the door had been locked. But he didn't tell them what he'd seen on the mirror upstairs, those 4 letters scratched into the condensation. Amen. But written backward, as if someone or something had been watching from the other side. He was only 12. She was 10, and grief aged them far beyond what the state knew what to do with. They were split up, 2 foster homes, 2 towns apart. No goodbye, just court papers, and a silence that became survival. But now, 22 years later, that photo, that impossible photo, revealed something neither had noticed before. In the bottom right corner, just beneath Maren's left hand, a smudge. Not a stain, not damage, but a symbol, a small spiral, one that mirrored the design carved into their father's old rosary, the one he said came from before the church knew what it meant. Elijah scanned the image again, heart pounding. Behind Maren, the chapel door was ajar, and something, or someone, stood inside the shadow, barely visible. Not a person, a shape. Tall, thin, like smoke caught mid-breath. Elijah didn't decide to return to the chapel. He found himself driving before he realized where he was. Going, the gravel crunched beneath his tires like brittle bones, echoing in the vast silence of Ash Hollow. The road to St. Jude's hadn't changed, narrow, canopied by ash trees that clung to their branches like old memories refusing to fall. The fog was thicker here, laced with the scent of burning wood that didn't come from any fire he could see. The chapel stood as it had in the photo, untouched, unburned, almost untouched by time itself. Its steeple leaned slightly now, like a figure listening. The bell, the same bell that rang the hour of their parents' death, hung rusted, silent. Elijah stepped out of the truck. The wind greeted him with a familiar sting, as if the land remembered him, as if it resented his return. He approached the door. It was old oak, and yet no signs of fire touched it. No blackened corners, no scent of smoke. It should have been ash, but it breathed. His hand hovered over the brass handle. Then, with a creak that echoed into his chest, it opened on its own. Inside, nothing had moved. The pews sat in neat rows, blanketed with dust thick enough to silence any footstep. The altar still bore the statue of St. Jude, the patron of lost causes. Only now his eyes seemed cracked, his face wet with condensation from within. But what chilled Elijah most was not the statue. It was the drawing. Pinned gently to the front pew with a red ribbon was a child's sketch, a chapel, a fire, a girl with braids, and beside her a boy with no face. He stepped closer. The sketch was unmistakably Maren's. Her initials were in the bottom corner, the looping MW she always signed with, followed by a tiny cross. But she hadn't drawn like this since the night of the fire. Elijah backed away. The silence inside was no longer peaceful. It was pressing, like lungs holding air too long. The kind of silence that hums, that waits. And then he heard it. A note, a single musical note, played from somewhere beneath the chapel. Not mechanical, not digital, a piano key, middle C, soft, hollow, familiar. He turned toward the side door, the one that led to the crypt. He hadn't been down there in years, not since their mother taught music lessons to the choir children and said the acoustics were God's echo. The air grew colder with each step down. The stone beneath his boots felt wet, almost pulsing. And as he reached the landing, he saw it. A new candle, fresh wax, still warm. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. And on the bench before the ancient piano, a coat, small, faded yellow, with a tag stitched inside. M. Whitlow, Maren's childhood coat. Elijah's throat tightened. He reached for it, but before his fingers made contact, the air changed. Not the temperature, the weight. It was as if the chapel itself took a breath, and from the far corner of the crypt came a whisper. Not words, not language, just a memory trying to speak. He froze. The whisper wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. It slithered along the edge of the walls like breath behind skin, brushing his ears with the softness of memory, but none of its mercy. Elijah stepped back from the coat. It lay there, as if Maren had just taken it off, as if she would return any second. But the longer he stared at it, the less it looked like clothing, and more like a husk. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Still not words, but rhythm. Almost like breathing, 3 short inhales, a pause, 2 exhales. It was the same pattern their father used to teach them for calming down during panic attacks. The holy rhythm, he called it. Elijah's chest began to tighten. His hands trembled, sweat forming cold beneath his jacket. He hadn't felt panic like this since the night Maren screamed outside the fire, begging him not to open the upstairs door. He turned to leave the crypt, but the stairway had vanished. No sound, no collapse, just gone. In its place stood solid wall, old stone carved with symbols too worn to read. As if the chapel was rearranging itself. His breath caught in his throat. The candle beside the piano flickered, but no wind touched it. And then came the scent. Cinnamon, the scent of his mother's last meal. He turned back toward the piano and saw the keys move, not all at once, one at a time. One at a middle C, then A, then D. It was spelling something. Cad. That was his father's monogram, Caleb Augustine Devereux, a man who was buried with a sealed casket and no official autopsy. Elijah's mind spiraled. This wasn't grief. This was something watching. Something remembering him, even when he had tried to forget. He stepped backward again and hit something soft. Not a wall, not stone, fabric. He turned. A nun's habit, hung on a rusted coat rack, but still warm, still damp. And the veil, it was stitched with the same spiral from the photo. Elijah stumbled away and reached into his coat. He still had the photograph. He unfolded it with shaking hands, but it had changed. Maren's smile was gone. Her eyes now looked directly at him, and where the chapel door once stood open, it was now shut, with the same spiral carved into its center. He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, heart pounding, lungs shallow, and in the silence, the whisper came again. But this time, it spoke. You were supposed to follow her. It wasn't Maren's voice, it wasn't his father's, it was a child's voice, his own, speaking from a place he didn't remember ever being. Did you feel that too, right? I felt the presence. The candle extinguished itself, and Elijah was alone. Not in the crypt, not in the chapel, but in a memory so deep. It had waited 22 years to surface, and now it was opening its eyes. He blinked. And when he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the crypt anymore. He was standing outside the house, their house, unburned, whole, exactly as it was the night before the fire. The sky above was ink black, but the windows glowed softly with golden light. Smoke curled from the chimney. The familiar hum of their mother's piano trickled into the night air like lullabies half remembered. Elijah's boots crunched over frost-bitten grass as he stepped toward the porch. He wanted to call out, but his voice caught in his throat like a secret too dangerous to speak. He touched the front doorknob. It was warm, alive. And when he pushed it open, time inhaled. There, in the living room, sat his father, younger, stronger, untouched by whatever it was that hollowed him out in the final weeks. He was polishing a rosary, eyes fixed on nothing, humming low in his throat. Their mother stood in the kitchen, stirring something over the stove. The scent of cinnamon filled the room again. Maren sat on the floor sketching, her braid coiled neatly across her shoulder. It was all before the scream, before the heat, before they stopped saying each other's names. He stood there, unseen, like a ghost inside his own past. "Why am I here?" he whispered. And then Maren looked up. She looked through him, not in fear, not in shock, but in recognition. "Elijah," she said. Her voice was steady. "You forgot what really happened." The walls began to flicker, like old film stuttering between frames. His father's hum turned to a chant. The rosary slipped from his fingers and shattered into ash on the rug. Their mother turned around, her eyes blank, bleeding light, and in her hand, a spiral carved from bone. "Elijah," Maren said again, standing now, her eyes filled with something ancient. "You left me behind." He shook his head. "No, I looked for you. I waited. You ran." "No," she whispered. "You chose not to remember." The piano behind them began to play on its own, a hymn he hadn't heard in years, the same one she sang the night of the fire, but in reverse, as if time itself was unraveling. He stepped backward, but the door behind him had vanished. The walls pulsed, the shadows moved. Maren stepped closer, and for the first time in 2 decades he saw it, not just the scar on her cheek, but the burn marks around her wrists, thin, circular, like she'd been held down by something. "You were meant to see," she whispered, "but you closed your eyes." A crack appeared in the ceiling, then another, and from those cracks voices poured like black water, whispers in Latin, cries of children, and beneath it all, his own voice, as a boy, saying something over and over. "I didn't open the door, I didn't open the door, I didn't open." But he had. He knew that now, and what they saw, was never meant to survive. The room collapsed into flame, but this time, he didn't run. He looked at Maren, tears spilling down his face, and for the first time in 22 years, he remembered what was behind that door, and why it never burned. The fire didn't consume him. It held him gently, almost reverently, like a veil of memory folding inward. And when the heat faded, Elijah found himself sitting in a wooden chair, the chapel again. But not how he remembered it. It was cleaner now, lit only by candlelight. The pews had been pushed to the sides, and in the center of the nave, facing the altar, stood a single confessional, the kind with a black curtain and a brass cross above the lattice. The curtain was open, and inside sat someone, not a priest, not a stranger. Maren, older, alive. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. Her face was thinner now, touched by the soft sadness of someone who has lived too long with a truth no one else believed. "I thought you'd never come," she said. Elijah didn't speak. His throat was tight with the weight of everything he had buried, not just in memory, but in will. "Do you remember now?" she asked. He nodded, slowly, then more urgently. "I opened the door," he said. His voice broke. "I opened it. I shouldn't have, but I had to know." "I know," she whispered. And suddenly, he was 12 again, his hand trembling on the brass handle of that upstairs door, the sound of flames in the hallway, his mother's scream from below, and behind the door, the chanting, low, guttural, inhuman, not words, not even sound, more like hunger with a voice. Inside the room he had seen it, the mirror, but not just a reflection, a figure behind it, moving with him, mimicking him, until he spoke the word Amen, and the mirror shattered from within. That was the moment Maren arrived. She had seen him there, frozen, facing the broken glass. She had pulled him away, screamed his name, tried to block his sight with her hands. But it was too late. What had seen him had marked him. "I couldn't sleep after that," he said now. "Not for years. I kept dreaming of smokers, but not from fire, from breath, something breathing just beneath the surface of the walls." Maren nodded. "I saw it too, but you never asked." "I thought you hated me," he said. She looked away. I didn't hate you, Elijah. I envied you. You got to forget. He stepped closer to the confessional. The curtain swayed as if moved by something invisible. I wanted to believe it was just trauma, he whispered, that we imagined it, that it was our minds protecting us. But it wasn't, she said. There was something in that room, something Father was trying to keep locked away, and when he failed, it attached. He looked into her eyes. Attached to who? Maren lowered her gaze. To both of us. The candles around them flickered violently, and from somewhere beneath the chapel a deep groan, wood shifting, earth sighing. Elijah's hand found hers. It was cold, too cold. You left, he said. I had to. I was hearing things, seeing things. I thought if I stayed I'd hurt you. You were 10, he said. It wasn't your fault. She finally met his eyes again, and in them he saw a truth deeper than anything he had faced. I still hear it, she said. Every night. But when I saw the photo, I thought maybe it was calling us back, not to punish us, but to finish something. Elijah closed his eyes. I'm ready, he said, for the rest. The chapel seemed to lean in closer, like stone eavesdropping on their silence. Maren stepped out of the confessional, her shadow stretched unnaturally across the floor, splitting at the center like two separate forms. For a moment, Elijah thought it was a trick of the candlelight, but the second shadow moved even when she didn't. Elijah, she said, her voice trembling now, there's something I never told you. She walked toward the altar. Her steps echoed like a metronome winding toward confession. After the fire, after they separated us, I was placed with a foster family in Bitter Creek, but I couldn't sleep. I kept waking up with scratches on my arms. I kept hearing his voice, not Father's voice, its voice, the one from the mirror. Elijah stood still. Every part of his body screamed to run. But he knew, deep down, he knew. The moment. He opened that door 22 years ago. Something ancient had seen him and entered them. I thought I was going mad, Maren continued, until one night I heard my foster brother speaking in tongues in his sleep, the exact same chant from that room. She turned toward Elijah, eyes glistening. I asked him where he heard it. He said, a man with no mouth told me in the mirror. Elijah's stomach dropped. And then? He asked, voice low. He stopped breathing that night, she said, swallowing hard. No explanation, no marks. Just still. The second shadow at her feet began to tremble. I tried to run. I was placed with another family, then another. But it followed. Every house, every mirror. Every time I tried to look away, it was behind me. She walked. Back toward him, slower now. It didn't want me to die, it wanted me to remember. Elijah's hands balled into fists. Why us? Maren stopped. Her voice fell into something deeper, more ancient. Because we were given to it. Silence. What do you mean? He asked. She turned back toward the confessional, and for the first time Elijah noticed what was carved into the wooden seat. A spiral of beats and 3 letters. C.A.D., their father's initials. It wasn't an accident, she whispered. Father made a pact. Elijah stumbled backward. No, he wouldn't. He did, Maren said, her voice almost breaking. I read his journals, the ones he kept hidden in the chapel walls. He was trying to protect us from something. Something he had already invited in. He thought binding it to blood would contain it. But the ritual, it demanded both of us. Elijah's breath turned shallow. That's why he screamed. Maren nodded. He broke the seal, and when you opened the door, it was free. A loud crack echoed through the chapel. The spiral on the confessional began to glow faintly, bleeding red light. The air thickened, heavier with every breath. I didn't betray you, Maren said softly. But he did. He gave us up, and then tried to stop it too late. That's why Mom died. She tried to stop him. That's why she was at the door. That's what she was holding. Elijah's knees buckled. The truth hit like ice in his lungs. They weren't just survivors. They were inheritors. Inheritors of a blood-bound curse sealed in mirrors and hymns. And the photo, a summoning. "It wants to finish what it started," Maren whispered. "It called us here for a reason." The spiral behind her pulsed like a heartbeat, and from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, a voice rose, 2 words. Both, return. The chapel walls moaned again, not from age, but remembrance. As if the structure itself had begun to remember what it was built upon. Elijah staggered toward the altar, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal, the rituals, the spiral. It wasn't just their story. It was part of something far older. "Do you remember what St. Jude's used to be before the convent?" Maren asked. Her voice was distant but firm. He shook his head. "A sanatorium," she said, "built in 1871, for the unwanted, the incurable, the possessed." She held up a piece of parchment, brittle, yellowed by time, stained at the edges. "I found this in the chapel basement last year. I wasn't ready to tell you then." The document was written in Latin, but the names were clear: C. Devereux, A. Whitlow, and a third name Elijah had never seen before. Valerius. "The Devereux line goes back to the original wardens of the asylum," she said. "Our family. And the Whitlows, my mother's side, were the caretakers." Elijah felt a cold tremor crawl up his spine. "We were never just a family," she whispered. "We were a seal." She handed him a second paper, a journal entry dated October 31st, 1899. "The containment is weakening. The spiral burns hotter. I fear Valerius lied. He said 2 children would be enough, bound in blood, divided in grief. But the entity grows louder in mirrors, in songs, in dreams. It demands to be known." Elijah's hands shook. "The spiral," he murmured. "It's not just a symbol. It's a lock," she said. "And we're the key. 2 bloodlines, 2 witnesses. 1 event to bind the gate shut forever." His heart raced. "And if we don't?" She looked at him, her eyes no longer hiding anything. "It opens." A wind rushed through the chapel, cold and wet, tasting of old soil and forgotten breath. The candles flickered again, some extinguished. Some flared violently. Maren pulled out a black and white photograph from her coat. It showed the original chapel, the sanatorium gate still intact. Standing in front of it were 4 figures: a priest, a nun, a child. And something that looked like a man, but wasn't. Its eyes had been scratched out, violently. But its mouth was carved into a permanent grin. "This is the original ceremony," she said. "They tried to seal it with hymns, with blood, but they failed. And every few generations, it reawakens, looking for the ones who carry the code." Elijah stared at the image. "And you think we can stop it?" "I don't think we can," she said. "I know we must." Another groan echoed from beneath the chapel floor, a vibration more than a sound. Dust rained from the rafters. The spiral on the confessional lit again. "Why now?" he asked. Maren's face was pale, but resolute. "Because the 22nd. Year always comes," she whispered. "It did in 1871, then again in 1893, 1915, 1937, always 22 years apart. The seal weakens on that cycle, and it chooses the next bloodbound." Elijah's mouth went dry. "And we're it," she nodded. "Elijah?" Her voice broke. "There's something else." The floor groaned once more. "I wasn't the only one it followed." He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" But she was already crying. "I saw it," she whispered. "Last month, in the mirror behind you." And slowly, like a body remembering how to breathe, Elijah turned, there behind him, not in the reflection but inside the mirror, a second pair of eyes, watching, smiling, remembering. The mirror didn't crack, it pulsed, as if it were not glass but skin, and something beneath it had just awakened. Elijah stumbled backward, his reflection flickering, splitting, then stitching itself together wrong. For a moment he saw himself grinning, not smiling, grinning, with eyes too black to be human. Maren pulled him away from it. "Don't look too long," she said. "It learns you, it remembers through the gaze." He turned, panting, and asked the question that had haunted him since the moment the photo fell into his hands. "Who sent?" "It, Maren. The photograph. Who sent it to me?" She hesitated, then looked toward the rear entrance of the chapel. "Elisa," she said. "Elisa?" The name hit him like ice water. She had been their neighbor back in Ash Hollow, an old woman, quiet, always praying, the one who gave them apple slices after school, who braided Maren's hair, who placed crosses on her windows with salt water. "She was part of it," Elijah whispered. "She was part of the protection," Maren said. "She was the last of the Valerius bloodline. After the fire, she found me. Said she had promised our mother that if anything went wrong, she would watch over us from afar." "She sent the photo?" "She kept it all these years," Maren nodded. "And when the seal began to weaken again, she said we had to be brought back. Together. She believed it had to be our choice this time, not ritual, not force, but willing return." The chapel groaned. The spiral behind them began to pulse with light. "And where is she now?" Maren's face darkened. "She's here." Elijah blinked. "What?" "In the back. In the side room where the choir used to meet. But she's not, well." He moved toward the door she pointed to. The old rehearsal room. He remembered it faintly. Their mother used to teach piano there. The room with thick red curtains and cold air that never warmed. He opened it. Inside, dim candlelight revealed a small cot, a bowl of untouched soup, and a figure seated in a chair, back turned, hands folded over a cane. "Elisa," Elijah said gently. No answer. He stepped closer. The room smelled of cedar, salt, and rosewater, the cleansing mixture, used in old rites. The air tingled with static like before a storm. "Elisa." He reached out, and her head tilted slowly, stiffly, as if moved by something else. She turned just enough to show her face. Her eyes had been covered with linen soaked in oil. But her mouth was moving, not speaking, reciting a chant, low old. One Elijah remembered from somewhere deep inside, not his mind but his blood. He fell to his knees. "She's binding it," Maren said behind him. "She's been here for months, chanting, keeping the gate weak enough for us to return, and strong enough so it doesn't slip out." Elisa's mouth trembled. Her voice cracked, dry from weeks of prayer. And then she whispered, "The final hour is upon the house of Ash. Both bloodlines must seal the breach, or the spiral births itself again." Elijah stood, heart racing. "And if we fail?" Elisa's head twitched. Her mouth didn't move. But another voice emerged, not hers, not Maren's, not his. A voice like wind through a coffin's crack. "Then silence shall become flesh." Elijah stepped back, and then came the whisper of a question, and soft but endless. "What would you do if the silence was protecting something sacred?" Elijah hadn't wept in 22 years, not when they buried his parents, not when they placed Maren in a car and drove her to another town, not when he woke from night terrors covered in sweat, with no one to say his name. But now, kneeling before the woman who had once braided his sisters' hair and prayed over their porch in silence, now blind, now trembling, now speaking in voices not her own, he wept. Because something in him knew. This was the end, not the end of the haunting, but the end of choosing not to see. Behind him, Maren lit a circle of candles on the chapel floor, forming a ring around the confessional. Each flame flickered in rhythm, as if following a breath not human, an ancient inhale stretching across centuries. "Once we begin," she said, "we don't stop, no matter what it shows us, no matter what it takes." Elijah stood slowly. The air had changed. He could feel it pressing on his ribs, as if trying to crawl inside. Maren handed him a black cloth. "Cover the mirror." He turned toward the tall standing mirror behind the altar, the one that hadn't been there when they arrived. It hadn't been carried in. It had formed. The frame was made of dark wood carved with spirals and Latin etchings that pulsed like veins. Inside, their reflections blinked out of rhythm, moving just slightly slower than they did. He lifted the cloth. His fingers trembled. As he covered the mirror, the glass screamed, not aloud, in the mind. like metal on bone, a shriek that made his molars ache. He fell to one knee, clutching his skull. "Elijah!" Maren knelt beside him. "It's fighting now. It knows we're close." He nodded, wincing. "It's inside the reflection," he whispered. "I saw myself smile before I even thought to smile." Maren held his hand. "You're not alone anymore." She stood and placed the final item at the center of the circle. Their father's shattered rosary, the one Elijah had kept buried in a tin box for over 2 decades, too afraid to touch. Now it lay like a broken snake in the dust, the crucifix still intact, but cold. "Elisa said the entity feeds on unfinished sacrifice," Maren said. "That's why it chose us, because the ritual was never completed. We were offered, but never sealed." "And now it wants closure," Elijah said. "No," she replied. "It wants dominion." They both stepped into the candle circle. From above, the chapel's steeple groaned, a sound like the sky being bent. Dust rained from the rafters. The stained glass windows rattled in place, though no wind touched them. Then, silence. Thick, heavy, alive. Elijah closed his eyes, and into that silence he spoke the name he had never dared speak again. Caleb Augustin Devereaux. The flames bent inward, the air convulsed, and the room shifted. One by one, the pews disappeared. The stained glass melted into walls of stone. They were no longer in a chapel. They were beneath it, in the catacombs, in the place where the first bloodlines met. Torches ignited on their own. Moss dripped from the ceiling, and in front of them stood a stone altar. Upon it, a book, bound in flesh, sealed with wax in the shape of a spiral. "It's real," Elijah breathed. "The book of the offering," Maren said. "It's the record of every child chosen, every failed ritual, every pact." They approached slowly. The air thinned. Maren reached for the wax seal, but Elijah grabbed her hand. "No," he said. "It took your voice for years. Let me be the one to see it now." He broke the wax. The book opened with a sound like exhalation. Pages flipped on their own, faster than he could read, until it stopped. Their names. Elijah Whitlow Devereaux. Maren Whitlow Devereaux. Next to their names, offertum non completum, offering incomplete. And below that, written in a different hand, older, darker, "If the silence is broken, the seal must be made by consent. Blood, mirror, name." Maren drew a knife from her coat, the same one their mother used to cut communion bread. "Elijah," she said softly, "are you ready?" He nodded. They each took the blade, pressing it gently to the base of their thumbs. Blood rose slowly, bright and thick. They reached out together, hands joined, and let their blood drip onto the rosary. The spiral glowed red. The candles erupted. And from behind the veil covering the mirror, a sound. Not a scream, not a chant. A song, their mother's voice. Singing the lullaby from the night of the fire, only now reversed. Maren gasped. "She's still here." "No," Elijah whispered. "It's using her voice." The cloth lifted itself, and there in the glass was their mother, burned, but smiling, mouthing something neither of them could hear. Behind her, him, their father, but not as they remembered. His eyes were missing, his arms outstretched, and from his chest. The spiral burned like a brand. "Join us," the reflection mouthed. The room darkened, the book snapped shut. The mirror shook violently. Maren screamed, not in pain but in memory. Elijah turned to her and saw her shadow split again. 3 now, 1 for her, 1 for him, 1 for it. "It's trying to enter," she cried. "We have to finish the seal." Elijah grabbed the rosary, held it to his chest, and in one breath they both shouted the ancient word written beneath their names in the book, "Exuro." I burn, I release. The mirror shattered inward, the spiral cracked in 2, and with it, the room fell silent, completely, utterly, as if the world had exhaled for the final time. Then, light, a soft golden glow from above. The stone melted back into wood. The catacombs returned to pews. The book was gone, and they were back in the chapel. the confessional empty, the mirror destroyed, Elisa gone. But the air, it no longer hummed, it no longer waited. It was still. Maren collapsed into Elijah's arms, and for the first time in their lives, there was nothing left to fear. They didn't speak for a long time. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because silence might, for the first time in their lives, wasn't dangerous anymore. The chapel stood around them, quieter now, still worn, still old, but no longer watching. The air didn't press against their skin. The mirrors were gone, and the spiral, once pulsing like a heartbeat from another realm, had faded into dust. Maren sat at the foot of the altar, her knees pulled close to her chest, staring at the sunlight pouring through the broken, stained glass. It was morning, real morning, not a false light conjured by ancient rites or haunted memory. Elijah stood, at a distance, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the pew in front of him. He hadn't looked at her yet, not fully, as if doing so would confirm that it was over, or worse, that it wasn't. Maren, his voice was hoarse. She turned her head. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. She had waited for this moment for most of her life. "I blamed you." The words dropped like stone. "I blamed you for pulling me away from that door, for not letting me see everything, for running, for not coming back. I told myself it was your fault that I never understood what really happened." She lowered her eyes. The pain was not fresh, it was old, but still tender. "But the truth is," he inhaled, "I blamed you because I couldn't face what I had done. I opened the door, Maren. I heard the sound. I saw the mirror shatter. I felt it enter." She stood slowly, walked toward him with bare feet brushing over candle wax and ashes. "I never hated you," she said softly. "I never wanted to leave you. But I saw it in your eyes that night, the way the darkness recognized you. And I was afraid it would follow you if I stayed." He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a sister broken by time, but a woman who had spent 2 decades carrying both of their pain in silence. "I missed you every day," he whispered. "So did I," she said, "but I thought you were better without me, and I couldn't bear the thought of bringing it back to you." They stood in the center of the chapel, surrounded by dying candles and broken pews, and slowly they reached for each other's hands, fingers intertwined, warm, real. "Do you forgive me?" he asked. Tears welled in her eyes. "I already did," she said. Then gently, "Do you forgive me?" He nodded. "More than you know." The light from above seemed to brighten. The dust in the air shimmered like gold. And for the first time, the chapel no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary. Maren looked toward the altar. "There's something I want to show you," she said. They walked together side by side to the rear of the chapel, where the choir used to rehearse, where the hidden archives were stored. A small iron door remained locked for decades, until now. Maren reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old brass key. "Elisa gave me this before the final ritual," she said. "She told me it belonged to our mother, and that one day I would know when to use it." The key fit. The door opened with a sigh. Inside was a room filled with wooden crates, old hymnals, water-damaged scrolls, and relics too old for memory. The air was thick with history, but no longer with malice. In the far corner, a cedar box rested beneath a linen cloth. Elijah knelt and opened it. Inside was the photograph, the original, unburned, unsmudged, whole. There they were, Elijah and Maren, children, smiling, and behind them, no spiral, no figure in shadow, just the sky. "It changed," he said, breath catching in his throat. "No," Maren replied. "We did." They stood, holding the photo between them like a relic, a page from a life that had finally been returned. "Should we take it?" Maren asked. Elijah looked at the altar, then back at the photo. "No," he said. "Let it stay. This chapel needs to remember." They placed it on the altar, 2 candles on either side, and for the first time since, The fire, the altar, didn't feel haunted. It felt healed. Maren stepped back and looked up at the steeple. "Do you remember the bell?" she asked. He smiled. "We haven't rung it since that night." They walked slowly to the rope, frayed, stiff, heavy with silence. Together, they wrapped their hands around it. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. They pulled. The bell roared to life, a deep, echoing sound that spilled out over Ash Hollow like thunder softened by grace. It rang once, then twice, and with each toll, it felt like something ancient was being released. Like the land itself was exhaling. They stood beneath it, watching light fill the windows, and for a moment they didn't feel like survivors. They felt like children again, safe, found, whole. The bell fell silent after the sixth toll, not because they stopped pulling, but because it chose to stop, as if the chapel had heard enough, as if heaven itself had acknowledged the sound. Elijah let go of the rope, hands slightly blistered. Maren stood beside him, eyes closed, chest rising and falling, with the rhythm of someone who had been holding her breath for half her life. They didn't speak, because something had changed, not just in the chapel, not just between them, but in them. A stillness had entered, not the suffocating kind that haunted them in childhood, but a sacred stillness, a silence that meant something. It was time. Elijah reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the broken crucifix from their father's rosary. The metal was worn, blackened, bent, but it still held its shape. He placed it in the center of the altar. "Do you remember when he gave us this?" Elijah asked quietly. Maren nodded. "We were 8. He told us it had been passed down from the very first Devereaux who came to Ash Hollow. He said it was meant to protect us." Elijah looked at her. "But it didn't, did it?" "No," she said, "because protection only works when it's not built on fear." There was something in her voice, not anger, not blame, but surrender, a kind of spiritual resignation. She reached into the neckline of her blouse and pulled out a chain. At the end hung a tiny locket, one their mother had given her, the week before the fire. Maren opened it, revealing a single dried petal inside. "She said it was from a rose that bloomed in winter," Maren whispered. "She called it a miracle." She took the locket off and placed it next to the crucifix. "For her," she said. Elijah took a breath, and then reached once more into his coat, pulling out the final piece, the photograph, the one they found in the archives, now whole, now sacred. He placed it between the crucifix and the locket, not as an offering, but as a memory, a declaration. They had been broken, they had been chosen, they had been spared, but now they were returning the story, letting the place itself remember so they no longer had to carry it alone. "What do we say?" Elijah asked. Maren stepped forward and stood at the front of the altar. She lit a single candle and spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with reverence. "We return what never belonged to us. We break the silence that wasn't ours to hold. We forgive what could not be understood, and we release what was never meant to follow us." The candle flame grew higher, steadier, and in its glow the crucifix gleamed for the first time in years. Elijah added his voice, heart pounding with each word. "We name the wound. We cleanse the mirror. We surrender the inheritance of fear. And we walk forward, as children of memory, not prisoners of it." And then, together, they whispered the final word, a word that had waited 22 years to be spoken. The name written beneath their father's final entry in the Book of the Offering, Emet, truth. The candle bent inward, as if pulled by invisible breath, then flared and extinguished itself. The smoke rose toward the rafters in a spiral, but this time it was gentle. Not ominous, not hungry, just smoke, just release. Outside, the clouds parted. A single beam of golden light spilled through the broken stained glass, illuminating the photograph on the altar. 2 children, smiling, unafraid. And for the first time since that day, Elijah smiled too. Not a mask, not a shield. A real smile. One born of surrender, of knowing he would never have all the answers, of finally understanding that healing didn't come from defeating the past, but from choosing not to carry it into the next room. Maren stepped down from the altar and wrapped her arms around him. They held each other for a long time. The chapel didn't speak, didn't groan, didn't pulse. It simply stood, like a witness finally allowed to rest. They gathered their things, what little they had, and walked toward the exit. But before crossing the threshold, Maren paused. She turned back toward the altar. "I don't think we were meant to destroy the spiral," she said. "I think we were meant to rewrite it." Elijah nodded, and together they walked out into the light, not reborn, not erased, but remembered, and now free. The road away from the chapel was narrow. Dirt mixed with snowmelt, stones rising from the ground like old teeth. The trees stood taller than they remembered, or maybe they had just grown smaller inside. Elijah and Maren walked side by side in silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence that traps breath in the lungs and freezes memory in the chest. This silence was a companion, a space, a clearing. Birdsong returned to the woods. The wind no longer whispered warnings, only passed gently between leaves, brushing their shoulders like a prayer. For the first time in 2 decades, they didn't need to ask where they were going. They were not running, they were not searching, they were walking away, and with full hearts, with eyes that had seen the storm and remained open. About halfway down the hill, they passed a wooden bench, half swallowed by moss. Maren smiled. "This is where I used to sit after piano lessons," she said. "Before walking home, I used to think the trees listened better than people." Elijah chuckled, brushing off the bench with his sleeve. They sat, and for a while, they just were. The kind of stillness that only comes after you've buried the right things. Not the people, not the past, but the expectations. The lies. The idea that wounds make you unworthy of joy. The sun dipped low, bleeding amber across the trees. Elijah reached into his coat, now almost empty of the tokens he had clung to, except for one. He pulled it out, a folded scrap of paper, the one that had been inside the photograph frame. "I never told you what this said," he murmured. He unfolded it. The writing was uneven, clearly their father's, but the words were not instructions. Not rituals, just a sentence. "Even shadows obey the light when someone dares to shine it." Maren's eyes glistened. "I wonder if he knew," she whispered. "Knew what?" "That we'd come back, that we'd survive it." Elijah nodded slowly. "I think he hoped we would. Maybe not for him, but for each other." She reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a long while, letting the day stretch around them, letting the memory of the chapel settle in their bodies, not as tension, but as closure. It was strange how healing rarely comes in lightning bolts or loud voices. It comes like this, in glances, in benches, in a silence that feels like a hand on your back instead of a hand on your throat. Eventually, they stood, not because they needed to go, but because they could. They followed the trail deeper into town. The houses looked smaller now. Some had new fences, new faces. But the bones of Ash Hollow remained the same. Old wood, crooked chimneys, porch swings that moved in rhythm with the breeze. Children played near the riverbed. Dogs barked in yards. And no one noticed the 2 siblings who had returned from something ancient, who carried in their bodies the ending of a story no one else remembered had begun. And that was enough. They reached the edge of town just as the church bells rang noon, not the chapel, the main cathedral. Its bell had always been brighter, cleaner, free of ghosts. Maren paused and looked up at the tower. "Elijah," she said quietly, "do you think we're safe now?" He thought about that, about the mirror, about the chant that echoed in his dreams, about the spiral that still flickered behind his eyes when he blinked too long. "No," he said honestly, "I don't think we're safe." She raised an eyebrow. "But I think we're whole." And for them, that was better than safety. Wholeness doesn't promise the absence of danger. It promises the presence of yourself. It tells you that when the shadows return, you'll know how to stand in them and how to walk through. They continued walking. At the edge of town was a small trail that curved toward Bitter Creek. It passed by the river, It passed by the cemetery. Elijah looked toward the graveyard, quiet and overgrown, a dozen stones half swallowed by time. He stopped. Maren followed his gaze. "Do you want to go?" He nodded. They walked through the rusted gate and followed the familiar path until they found them. 2 headstones, one chipped, one nearly unreadable. Augustine Caleb Devereux, Adeline Whitlow Devereux. Elijah knelt. Maren remained standing. They didn't cry. They simply stood in the presence of those who had broken and tried to protect, those who had failed and loved them anyway. "I forgive you," Elijah whispered, and as if the wind had waited years to carry those words, it rose gently, brushing past the trees. No reply came, but he wasn't waiting for one. Because forgiveness doesn't require applause. It's the echo that frees you, not them. Maren knelt beside him. "I hope you found peace," she whispered, "and if you didn't, we did." They stood, the wind calmed, and the trees swayed with something deeper than movement. Gratitude. They walked out through the iron gate, not looking back. Sometimes closure looks like a locked door. Sometimes it looks like a mirror breaking, but sometimes it looks like 2 siblings walking toward the unknown with nothing chasing them anymore. They left Ash Hollow the next morning. No ceremony, no bags. Packed. Just the clothes on their backs and hearts lighter than they had been in 2 decades. There was no need to say goodbye, because Ash Hollow in all its haunted beauty would never forget them. And strangely, they no longer needed it to. The past had been witnessed. The silence had spoken. The mirror had cracked. And the 2 names written in the Book of the Offering, Elijah and Maren, were no longer bound by blood alone, but by something deeper. Truth, chosen together. They drove in silence for hours. The landscape shifted slowly, from dense forest to open fields, from stone walls to paved fences. The world felt wider now, as if the story had finally stepped outside the chapel walls and taken a deep breath. Maren rolled down the window. The wind rushed in, soft and cold, carrying the scent of pine and something older, like old paper, burned incense, and hope. Elijah glanced at her. "Where do we go now?" She smiled faintly. "Anywhere." He nodded. "Then let's go somewhere we're not running from." Later that night, in a small inn off Route 5, Elijah sat alone on the balcony while Maren slept. He held the last object they'd kept. Not the photograph, not the locket, not the rosary. It was the spiral, drawn in pencil on the corner of a napkin from the diner where they'd eaten that afternoon. No power, no curse, just a shape, neutral, meaningless, unless you chose to give it meaning. Elijah stared at it. He folded the napkin once, then again. He placed it into the hotel Bible on the nightstand and closed it without a word. Some stories didn't need to be burned, just returned. In the morning, he'd forget which page he left it on. And maybe someone else one day would open it and wonder. But they wouldn't find fear. They'd only find a symbol, and maybe, just maybe, a doorway into their own healing. Because the truth was no longer cursed, it was sacred. Elijah turned off the light, and for the first time in 22 years, he slept without dreams. No reflections, no footsteps in the hall, no hymns played in reverse. Only quiet, only breath, only peace. And in the distance, long after they had gone, in the chapel now abandoned once more, the morning light poured through the broken glass. It struck the altar like gold, illuminating 3 simple objects: a rusted crucifix, a dried rose petal, and a photograph of 2 children, smiling. Nothing moved, nothing whispered, nothing waited. Just stillness, just memory. And above them, carved faintly into the arch of the altar, weathered by fire, softened by time, a single line remained. What is not remembered repeats. But this time they remembered. So it didn't have to.